Before this video begins, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you to every single person who subscribed and supported this channel. Reaching 100 subscribers means more than you can imagine. I also want to give a special thanks to everyone who left motivating and supportive comments. Your words truly inspired me and gave me the motivation to keep creating more content. Your support keeps these stories alive, and the next ones will be darker, scarier, and unforgettable. Thank you for being part of Echo Horror Files. And now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the darkness begin. I took the ranger position at Glacier in late August because I needed to disappear. Not from the law, from myself. 6 years in Denver's homicide division had hollowed me out in ways a therapist would take years to articulate. The commendations meant nothing. The solved cases meant nothing. What remained was a cavity in my chest that no amount of whiskey could fill, and a tremor in my hands that made other detectives uncomfortable. The job posting appeared like fate. Remote patrol ranger, Lake McDonald sector, seasonal to year-round. Solitude, mountains, a cabin, a lake. Work with my hands instead of my mind. Document wildlife, help lost hikers. That was honest work. My name is Coda. My mother was Blackfeet, though she left the reservation before I was born. She never talked about it, and I never pushed. But when I saw the posting, something in my DNA recognized Glacier as a homecoming. The mountains knew things, knew how to keep secrets. The application was straightforward. The background check came back clean despite the psychiatric evaluation. They hired me based on my wilderness credentials and mountain certifications. No one asked why a homicide detective wanted to trade his badge for a ranger uniform. The cabin sat 2 miles up from the main lodge, accessible only by fire road from May to November. Isolation was the point. By late September, I was settled into the routine. Dawn patrols along the north shore of Lake McDonald, afternoon trails, evening radio checks. The autumn light was extraordinary, the kind that made you understand why people risk their lives in these mountains. The first thing I noticed about the park was how it monitored you. Cameras at the visitor centers, spotters at overlooks, trail registers, everything tracked, everyone cataloged. There was comfort in that observation, even as I craved isolation. At least if something went wrong, there would be evidence. The second thing I noticed was the wildlife patterns. I've read Aldo Leopold. I understand predator-prey dynamics, seasonal migration, but there was something off about the ungulate behavior around the eastern ridge. Deer moving wrong, moving at angles that didn't match their skeletal structure. I mentioned it to Dale, another ranger, during our September coordination meeting. He didn't respond well. "Coda," he said slowly, "don't start with that. People come here and they see things. They're tired, they're scared, they see wrong, and they make up explanations. Just document what you see in the standard way." I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but his expression warned against it. Dale had been at Glacier for 17 years. He knew something he wasn't saying. The cabin was built in 1967, according to the placard inside. Solid wood frame, storm windows, emergency supplies, a radio that crackled with weather reports and ranger communications, a landline that worked maybe 60% of the time, no cell service. The isolation I'd come for had sharp teeth when you stood at the window looking into the forest at dusk. October brought the hiking surge. Fall colors, perfect weather, families and couples and solo adventurers pushing deeper into the park before winter locked the gates. My job was search and rescue adjacent, patrol trails, check on lost parties, provide medical assessment. Most rescues were hype over substance, blisters, dehydration, one woman with a twisted ankle, one elderly man having chest pains who needed helicopter extraction. But there were the calls that didn't make it into the official reports. October 14th, a family of 4 reported missing. The mother and 2 kids were found 6 miles off trail, hypothermic but stable. The father, Marcus Hendricks, was lost for 3 days before search and rescue found him walking out on his own, confused and bleeding from multiple lacerations he couldn't explain. He was discharged from the clinic with instructions to follow up with his physician, but during the debrief, I was the ranger who filed the physical assessment. His wounds were wrong. 3 long parallel scratches down his back, but the spacing was too wide for a human hand, too deep, too deliberate. And the way he described finding his way out didn't match the terrain or his physical state. "I heard something," he said. His eyes weren't tracking properly. It was like deer, but I could hear it walking like a person, footsteps. Then something was beside me on the trail. Looked like a doe, but the legs were. The medic cut him off and got him moving toward the exit. We never finished the statement. The second incident happened on October 19th. 2 hikers, both experienced, both doing a standard loop on the Gunsite Pass route. They made it back, but one of them, a man named Vernon Cho, needed psychiatric evaluation. He kept asking about the thing that wasn't a deer. "It followed us," he said repeatedly. "For 6 miles it followed, matching our pace. When we looked at it, it was frozen. In that way, deer freeze. But when we looked away, we could hear it. The way it moved. Not right." Again, the official narrative was incomplete. The hikers were tired, had seen shadows, mountain stress. Environmental conditions can create perceptual distortions. But I'd hiked those trails. I knew what shadows looked like in autumn. The third incident was different. October 22nd, I found the remains. I was doing a standard patrol of the shore path, moving south from the cabin, when I caught the smell. Carrion. Recent. The forest smelled wrong. And my detective instincts, the part of me I'd tried to bury in these mountains, switched on. The remains were 50 yards off trail, scattered. A mule deer, multiple bullet wounds, which wasn't unusual. Hunter season was active, but the corpse had been positioned, arranged almost. The legs were splayed at angles that suggested something had been standing on them. The torso was exposed, ribs opened like a flower, organs removed with precision. Not predator feeding. This was surgical. I documented it per protocol, called it in. Dale came up to assess with a junior ranger named Prescott. Dale took one look and turned away. "Poacher," Prescott said with confidence. "Quartering the animal, probably got spooked." But the precision was wrong. The lack of preparation signs was wrong. And Dale's face when he saw it, that was wrong. He knew something about the wrong things walking these trails. That evening, I sat on the cabin porch with a thermometer saying 34 degrees, watching the trees where the light was dying. The lake was flat, reflective, perfect mirror work. In the distance, a deer emerged at the shore. A young doe, standard coloring. She didn't drink. She just stood there, looking at the cabin. I watched her for 15 minutes. She never moved, never looked away. Just stood with that particular rigidity of certain animals. The ones that aren't quite right. The temperature dropped further, and a wind came through the pass that carried something acrid, something like copper and rot mixed together. When I looked back at the shore, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, because I recognized the feeling beginning to grow in my chest, the same hollow expanding that had driven me from Denver. The sensation of something watching from outside the logical frame, and I realized that I hadn't come to Glacier to heal. I'd come here because these mountains had called. They'd always been calling. By early November, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The trails I'd marked clean would show new disturbances, fresh scat but arranged, positioned, tracks that started in clearings and went nowhere, then resumed 200 yards away. The signature of something moving in ways that defied normal animal behavior. The game cameras showed nothing, but the absence in their footage was itself informative. Animals would avoid certain sections of trail. They'd loop around, and their behavior in those avoidance patterns showed signs of genuine fear. I wasn't the only one noticing. The reports started coming in more frequently. Wildlife encounters, unusual sightings. A family reported something following their car on the Going to the Sun road for 4 miles. A couple heard vocalizations at night outside their cabin that sounded like they couldn't describe it. Not animal, not human, something between. Prescott was scared. I could see it in the way he moved, the way his hand stayed near his service pistol on patrols. We did some trails together in early November, and I tried to get him to talk. You ever see anything wrong up here? I asked as we were doing the Flathead Pass route. He didn't answer for a long time. My grandfather was Salish, he finally said. Full blood. He told me once that these mountains had their own rules. That before the park, before the roads and the trails and the rangers, there were things here that knew how to hide from people. And that when people came and tried to organize the land to make it safe and documented, those things got angry. Things like what? Prescott stopped walking and looked at me directly. Not deer, he said. Whatever they look like from a distance, when you get close, they're not deer. My grandfather said they were old. He said they belonged to the mountains more than the mountains belonged to themselves. And he said rangers who stayed too long started to see them clearly, started to understand what they were. And then Prescott trailed off. Then what? I pressed. He said some rangers don't leave. They just disappear during their shifts. And the park explains it away. Accident, misadventure, suicide from the isolation. But he said it's the opposite. They don't leave because the mountains don't let them, because they've been noticed. I tried to dismiss this as folklore, superstition, the kind of cultural mythology that gets passed down without basis. But I'd seen the remains of that deer, I'd watched the doe at the shore, and I'd been a detective long enough to know that rational explanations sometimes collapse when you look at them too closely. The first hiker disappeared on November 3rd. His name was James Riddell. Solo through hiker, experienced, carrying proper equipment. He was doing a 5-day route starting at the North Fork area, planning to exit at St. Mary Lake. He had check-in points scheduled with a friend in Montana. When he missed his first check-in, the friend contacted the park. Standard missing person procedure triggered. The search started the next morning. 50 volunteers, trained SAR teams, helicopters, dogs. By the end of day 1, nothing. By day 3, still nothing. Day 5, and they were pulling in the broader teams, expanding the grid. I was assigned to patrol Sector 6, the area west of the main search perimeter. It was an area rarely hiked, dense with old growth and complex terrain. The thought was that Riddle might have gotten disoriented and gone off trail, ended up in the difficult country where standard search patterns would miss him. I found his campsite on day 6. The tent was intact, sleeping bags spread out, his food cache unopened. His boots were arranged neatly on either side of the tent entrance. No sign of struggle, no evidence of animal activity, no indication that anything had gone wrong. It was as if he'd simply stepped out of his world and into something else. I reported the location and waited for the main team to process the site. They brought in investigators from the nearest state police office. They documented everything. They found his journal. Riddell had documented 3 days of hiking. Good detail. Accurate trail notes, normal observations. Then the 4th entry. Something has been pacing the perimeter of camp all night. Not a bear, not anything I can identify. I can hear it moving in patterns that seem deliberate. It came to the tent at 3 a.m. I heard breathing, not predatory breathing, just patient, like it was waiting. When I turned on my headlamp, I didn't see anything through the mesh, but I felt it. The weight of something observing from just beyond the light. I hiked out at dawn, and now I'm back on the main trail, but I can hear it, matching my pace. Sometimes I see it. It looks like a deer, a young doe or elk. I can't decide. But the way it moves, the angles of its legs, something is profoundly wrong. I'm walking faster. I need to exit this section. The entry ended there. The next page was blank. The investigators concluded he'd experienced an acute mental health crisis, paranoia, possible drug use. They noted that his food was intact and concluded he'd wandered into the wilderness in a confused state. They organized a broader search, but with the assumption he was deceased. Exposure, hypothermia, natural conclusion to a man in mental distress. But I knew something they didn't. I'd seen the photographs of the boots before they bagged them. The soles had been arranged with geometric precision. And when the investigator wasn't looking, I'd flipped open Riddell's journal to the blank page after his final entry. In the margin, in handwriting I was certain wasn't Riddell's, someone had written, Come with us. The second hiker disappeared November 9th. This time it was a couple, Marcus and Jennifer Voss, late 30s, doing a moderate day hike on the Highline Trail. They had a check-in scheduled with hotel staff. They never showed. The search this time was quicker to mobilize. The park had learned. By day 2, we had resources everywhere. And by day 2, we found something. Jennifer Voss's day pack, abandoned on the trail. No other gear, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just left there as if she'd simply stepped out of it and kept walking. The search dogs went wild at that location. They wouldn't move further up the trail. They kept circling the day pack, barking, and then retreating. Their handlers said they were scared, actually frightened, which isn't common for trained search animals. Marcus was found 3 miles back, walking the wrong direction. When they brought him in for questioning, I attended the interview. He was coherent, alert, no signs of drug use or mental health crisis. He gave a clear statement of what had happened. We were on the trail, he said, just a standard hike. Good weather. Jennifer stopped to take a photograph. I kept walking ahead maybe 30 feet. When I turned around, she was fine, but something was beside her on the trail. What do you mean something? The investigator asked. I mean, there was something with her that wasn't there before. It looked like a deer, a really big mule deer, but it was standing like a person, on its back legs, kind of. Jennifer wasn't scared yet. She thought it was cool. She wanted to keep looking. But I could see its head moving in ways that didn't match a deer's physiology. The rotation was wrong. The angle was too far. And then it looked at me. He stopped talking, clearly struggling with something. What happened then? The investigator pushed. It made a sound, Marcus said, like a deer in distress, a bleat, but layered, like it was multiple animals vocalizing at the same time. And Jennifer, she just walked into the trees with it. I called her name. She didn't respond. It was like she couldn't hear me, like I wasn't in the same space as them anymore. They just kept walking, parallel to the trail, and then they were gone into the dense timber and I couldn't follow. I tried. I kept trying, but I'd gone the wrong way, and by the time I found my way back, I was confused about the direction. Did you see the animal's face? The investigator asked. Marcus thought about this for a long time. No, he finally said. I didn't want to, and I think that's why I'm still here, because it noticed that I was choosing not to look. Jennifer Voss was never found. The official narrative was that she'd been attacked by a grizzly and her body had been dragged into remote country. Glaciers and crevasses. The natural explanation, the search was scaled back. The focus shifted to recovery rather than rescue. The park released a statement about bear safety and the risks of wilderness travel. But that night, as I sat in the cabin doing paperwork, I received an email. It was from a forwarded account. The message contained a single photograph. It was Jennifer Voss. She was standing in what looked like a structure made of branches. The background was shadowy, obscured, but the setting didn't match anything in the park I recognized. She was looking directly at the camera. Her face was serene, almost smiling. The email header contained only text. She came willingly. I reported it to Dale. He read the message and didn't seem surprised. Delete it, he said. This is evidence. This is something, Dale interrupted, that has nothing to do with the National Park Service. And if you keep pursuing it, if you keep asking questions, the park will thank you for your service and tell you to leave, and then the things that remain will know you left unresolved. So you admit? I admit nothing, Dale said. I'm just telling you what I know. What I know is that being a ranger here means understanding the limits of your authority. These mountains don't care about our jurisdiction, and the things in them care even less. Why haven't you left? Dale looked out the cabin window toward the tree line. Because I saw it clearly once, he said. And I've spent 17 years understanding what that meant. And I think if I left now, it would follow me out of the mountains. So I stay here, and I do the work, and I don't ask questions about the pattern. That's the deal. The deal? We don't see them, they don't see us. We observe from sufficient distance. We don't investigate the remains. We don't pursue the missing. We maintain the boundaries between their world and ours. And it works. Most of the time. Most of the time, Dale left without answering. As November deepened, the park changed. The light took on a quality I couldn't articulate. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been given the angle of the sun. The sounds at night were more complex. Vocalizations that definitely weren't elk, definitely weren't anything that existed in any field guide. More people went missing. A group of 3 hunters, a family of 2, a solo researcher documenting climate impact. Each one followed the same pattern. Disorientation, descriptions of something that looked like deer but behaved wrong, and then disappearance. The park recovered some evidence. A jacket, a boot, a vehicle found abandoned with no signs of the occupants. The official count was 7 missing in November, though I suspected the real number was higher. I'd learned through the grapevine that similar disappearances had been reported for the past 3 years. They were documented, but they were explained away. Mental illness, accident, presumed deceased with insufficient evidence for thorough investigation. The thing was, the park needed these explanations. Because if these weren't accidents, if there was something in these mountains that was actively taking people, the park would have to close. The economic impact would be devastating. The liability would be catastrophic. So there was institutional pressure to accept benign interpretations, and I began to understand Dale's position. The cabin became less comfortable. The cold seemed to seep through the walls in ways that the thermostat couldn't explain. I found myself checking the doors and windows repeatedly at night. One evening, I found fresh prints in the dust on the windowsill. Prints that looked like a human hand, but with too many fingers. I also found something else. Cleaning out a drawer in the cabin's desk, I found a leather journal wedged in the back. It was weathered, old, dated 1989. The handwriting was careful, methodical. The first entry was dated August 15th, 1989. Arrived at the cabin today. Beautiful place. The isolation is exactly what I needed. We'll begin standard patrols tomorrow. I read through pages of normal ranger notes, trail conditions, wildlife observations, weather patterns. Then, mid-September, something is following the trails. Tracks that don't match any documented animal. The spacing is wrong. The depth is inconsistent. Dale says not to investigate further. He says rangers who investigate the wrong things don't last long up here. By October, the entries became sporadic and increasingly concerned. I've seen it clearly now. It wears the shape of an elk, but the proportions are wrong. The way it moves is too deliberate, too intelligent. It stands sometimes like a person. Last night it was at the window. I could see it clearly in the moonlight. It had no face, just a smooth surface where features should be. When I screamed, it didn't flinch. It just stood there, waiting. The last entry was November 3rd, 1989. 25 years ago to the day when James Riddell went missing. I'm going to follow them. I understand now. This isn't random. This isn't violence. This is invitation. They've been showing me, teaching me to see, and I think I'm finally ready. I'm going to walk into the forest and I'm not going to look back. Dale will say I had a breakdown. The park will say it's a tragedy, but I'll know the truth. I'm not disappearing. I'm arriving. The journal ended there. I sat with that for a long time. The cabin creaked around me. The wind picked up, and through the back window I saw movement, a shape. Too tall to be a human, too massive to be any deer. It was moving in that wrong way, the way that made my brain reject what my eyes were showing me. It came to the window and stood there. I didn't look directly at it. I don't know why. Every instinct said to look, to understand what was there. But some deeper part of me, the part that had survived 6 years in homicide, that had seen things most people never witnessed, that part knew that looking clearly would change something fundamental. So I kept my peripheral awareness on it, and I slowly walked to the radio. Glacier Station, this is Coda at Lake McDonald Cabin. I need immediate support. I have a wildlife encounter that's outside normal parameters. There was static. Then Dale's voice. What did you see? Something that isn't cataloged. Did you look at it directly? No. Good. Do not look at it directly. Keep the light on. Keep moving in small patterns. Don't run. Don't show fear. It's testing the boundaries right now, testing what you're willing to do. What is it? Something that was here before the park, before the mountains had names, before humans decided they could organize and protect nature. It's a watcher. And the good news is, if you don't see it clearly, you're not on its list. What if I refuse to stay? The radio went quiet for a moment. Then it will follow you out of the mountains. And you'll spend the rest of your life hearing the footsteps that match your pace, never quite catching you, never quite letting you leave. The shape pressed closer to the glass. I kept my eyes forward. What happened to the ranger whose journal I found? I asked. His name was Thomas. Good man, smart man, but he wanted answers. The mountains don't give answers, they give acceptance or refusal. He chose to accept. Is he still alive? That's not the right question. Alive is a human frame. He's still present. Some nights I can see him on the trails, moving with them. Not quite like them, but not quite like us either. He found what he was looking for. The shape moved away from the window. Winter came fast and hard that year. By mid-November, the first snow fell and the Going to the Sun Road was closed. The park transitioned to winter operations. Most of the rangers rotated out. Seasonal positions ended. The park became a white wilderness monitored by a skeleton crew. I stayed. Dale asked me directly if I was staying, and I said yes. He nodded like he'd expected it. Maybe he had. Maybe there's something about people who've seen the pattern and don't leave. Maybe we're recognizable to each other. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 30 below. The wind moved through the pass with a sound like vocalizations, and in the white silence I could see them clearly for the first time. They came in groups, 4 or 5 of them, moving through the frozen landscape in that wrong way. They looked like elk mostly, but the geometry was off. The legs bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. The heads rotated in full circles. And sometimes, when I was moving through the drifts doing winter patrols, I could see them walking beside me at the same pace. They never approached. They never attacked. They just watched. I understood what Dale meant about not looking directly. If I focused on them with full attention, if I let my conscious mind fully process what I was seeing, something would break. Some fundamental framework that separated my world from theirs would fail. So I learned to be aware of them peripherally, to know they were there without truly seeing. The missing persons reports had stopped. The SR efforts had been scaled back. The park officially closed the investigation into the November disappearances. Presumed deceased, insufficient evidence, natural conclusion. But they weren't dead. I knew that now. In December, I received a visitor. The road was closed. No traffic should have been possible. But Jennifer Voss walked out of the tree line one morning, completely unaffected by the cold. She walked directly to the cabin and stood at the door. When I opened it, her face was serene. Her eyes were black all the way through, iris to pupil to sclera. All black. I came to tell you, she said, and her voice had that layered quality, like multiple vocalizations compressed into human speech, that you don't have to be afraid. I was afraid, at first, but then I understood. We're not killers, we're watchers. We've been watching these mountains for longer than there have been mountains. We were invited here, the ones you call not dear, though we have no word for ourselves in your language. We were brought by something older, something that decided these peaks needed eyes that saw differently. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you can choose, she said. Like Thomas chose. Like the others chose. You can choose to accept, to stay, to see, to eventually become a watcher yourself. Or you can choose to leave. And if you choose to leave, you'll carry the knowledge that we're here. And you'll spend your life knowing that at any moment, we could choose to follow, to make you see what we see, to bring you back. That's not really a choice. It's the only choice that's ever offered in these mountains, Jennifer said. The mountains don't negotiate. They don't compromise. They only present options. And they're patient. They have forever. She walked away then, back into the tree line. I watched her go. She moved like they moved. Wrong angles, deliberate steps, not human, not animal. something that occupied a category that shouldn't exist. I thought about Thomas, whose journal I'd found, about the missing hikers and hunters and researchers, about the ones who'd accepted the invitation, and I thought about what Dale had said about the deal. I could leave. The choice was technically available. Once the spring thaw came and the roads opened, I could walk away, disappear into the world beyond the mountains, live a normal life. But I knew I wouldn't, because in the 6 weeks since I'd arrived at Glacier, I'd stopped feeling hollow. The thing in my chest that Denver had carved out, that whiskey couldn't fill, that therapy couldn't touch, the mountains had filled it. Not with peace, not with healing, with purpose. I was a watcher now. I could see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I radioed Dale that evening. "I'm staying," I said. There was a long pause. "Welcome," he finally said. "It's always better when they choose to understand before the choice is made for them." That night, I sat on the cabin porch in the brutal cold. The thermometer said -35. The wind pushed through the pass with a sound like voices, and in the snow between the cabin and the tree line, I saw them gathering. They didn't move. They just watched, their heads tilted in that wrong way, seeing me, seeing that I'd chosen, seeing that I would remain. The snow fell thicker. The lights of the cabin projected through the flakes like something from another world. And in the distance, from somewhere deep in the mountains, I heard the layered call, the sound that doesn't belong in any human framework. But I understood it now. It was an acknowledgement, a greeting, the voice of the watchers, welcoming another to their number. I didn't look away this time. I let myself see them clearly. All the geometric wrongness, all the impossible angles, all the deep blackness where eyes should be. And I felt something inside me shift, not die, shift. By spring, I knew I would be like Thomas, like Jennifer, like the others who'd accepted the mountain's offer. But until then, I was still mostly human, still mostly alive, still caught between the world I'd known and the world that was revealing itself to me. And I was grateful for the in-between, because the mountains had been calling since before I was born, since my Blackfeet blood carried the memory of these peaks. And I'd finally come home. We were all watchers now. We watched the trails where humans walked. We documented their stories. And sometimes, we invited the ones who were hollow inside, the ones searching for something the world couldn't give them. We gave them a choice, and if they were wise, they chose to stay. Just as I had chosen, in the darkness of the glacier winter, with the mountains holding their silence and the watchers moving through the snow in their wrong and ancient way, I finally understood why Dale had stayed for 17 years, why Thomas had written his final entry in 1989, why James Riddell had walked willingly into the trees, and why I, Coda, would never leave. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. And the mountains don't ask questions. My name is Cavi. That's what I go by now. I've worked seasonal ranger positions across the western parks for 8 years, mostly in the backcountry, mostly alone. The previous winter, something happened in Denver that made staying impossible. Not a crime, not exactly, but the kind of thing that makes people look at you differently when they recognize your name. I don't talk about it. The application process at Glacier didn't require me to. The Park Service values rangers who can handle isolation. My supervisor, Marcus, seemed satisfied with my background during the interview. 15 years of progressive experience in resource management, valid wilderness first aid certification, knowledge of wildlife behavior. He didn't ask why I was running. He just assigned me to the remote station at Raven Lake, a backcountry cabin about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. The cabin sits at 6,400 feet, perched on a narrow strip of federal land between dense forest and a body of water so cold and deep that nobody bothers fishing it anymore. The previous ranger, a man named Voss, had maintained it for 4 seasons before transferring to Yellowstone. The logbook entries were sparse and professional, mostly notes about weather, wildlife sightings, trail conditions. The last entry, dated October 15th, just said, "Everything normal. ready for winter rotation. I arrived in late September with supplies for 3 months. The cabin had wood stove heat, a propane lantern, and a radio that worked maybe 60% of the time. No electricity beyond solar panels that hadn't been cleaned in 2 years. No running water beyond what came from the lake. The isolation was absolute, which was exactly what I wanted. My job was straightforward. Maintain the trails, document wildlife activity, manage the emergency shelter protocols, and ensure the cabin system stayed functional. The nearest ranger station was a day's hike through dense forest. The nearest town was 2 hours by truck once you reached the main road. I was there to be a point of contact for the occasional backpacker who wandered too deep into the country, for the hunters who sometimes crossed into protected territory, and mostly to exist as a human checkpoint in a landscape that didn't really want humans. I expected loneliness. I got that immediately. The kind of loneliness that's almost peaceful at first. I spent the first 3 weeks cleaning the cabin and repairing equipment. The previous ranger had left the place in decent condition, though there were signs he hadn't liked it here. Personal items removed hastily, scratch marks on the doorframe from where he'd apparently wedged a chair against it at night. That detail stuck with me. Rangers know mountains. Voss wouldn't have done that without reason. In early October, the weather shifted. The afternoons remained clear, but the nights turned bitter, and by the second week of the month, snow was already accumulating at the higher elevations. I took inventory of food supplies and checked the emergency beacon 3 times. The isolation stopped feeling peaceful around day 28. That's when I started noticing the animals. The first sign was the silence. Anyone who spent real time in mountain wilderness knows that silence isn't actually silent. There are layers to it. Wind through evergreens sounds different than wind through aspen. Animal movement has a rhythm. The crack of a branch from an elk sounds different than a deer, different than a bear. Birds maintain a constant low conversation. When you tune into a landscape, you understand it's a composition with many small instruments. By October 20th, that composition had stopped. I noticed it during evening rounds when I walked the perimeter of the cabin and checked the trail markers. The forest pressed in from all sides, the trees so dense that visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in any direction. What had always seemed like peaceful quiet now felt like absence. No raven calls, though ravens had been constant through September. No jays warning each other about my presence. No scurrying from ground squirrels or pikas. The animals had withdrawn. I told myself it was seasonal behavior. The natural shift as creatures either hibernated or migrated south. But the logbook in my head, the one where rangers record observations they might not write down officially, noted something. Animals don't just leave. They phase out gradually. This was different. This was sudden. Then I saw the deer. It was crossing the small meadow behind the cabin, maybe 200 yards out, visible between the scattered whitebark pines that dotted the open ground. The meadow is one of the few clear sight lines in the immediate area, roughly 4 acres, surrounded by dense forest, with a few rocky outcroppings creating natural pathways. What made me notice it specifically was how it moved. Mule deer are common at this elevation, and I'd seen dozens already that fall. They move with a specific gait when they're calm, a kind of bouncing trot that's almost delicate. This one moved differently. Its legs bent wrong, too much articulation at the joints. Its gait was higher, more stilted, like it was learning how to walk. I was checking the radio equipment, standing outside the cabin with my back to the wall. When I first registered the animal, I didn't immediately turn to look. Instead, I watched it in my peripheral vision, the way you do when you're trying not to spook wildlife. The longer I looked, the more wrong it became. The proportions were off. Mule deer have certain dimensions: long bodies, thin legs, ears that are conspicuously large. This animal had a smaller head than any deer I'd ever seen, mounted on a neck that seemed too thick and short. The body was lean but angular in a way that suggested muscular definition rather than the natural grace of wild herbivores. The legs, those problematic legs, moved in a way that no ungulate should. It was like watching someone operate a body they hadn't quite figured out how to use. It took 4 steps into the meadow, then stopped. That's when I saw the eyes. I was far enough away that details should have been impossible, but the afternoon light hit them just right, and they caught and reflected. Not the soft brown I expected, darker, and positioned differently than they should be, more forward-facing, more predatory. I turned away from the window and went back inside, locked the door, told myself deer get sick sometimes, told myself parasites or disease could cause gait abnormalities, told myself I was exhausted and my perception was off. But I wrote the observation in the logbook anyway, dated October 20th. Mule deer observed with unusual morphology near East Meadow. Gait issues, possible illness, will monitor. The next morning, I found the hoof prints. They were at the edge of the meadow, and they were wrong, too. Deeper on one side than the other, as if the animal had an uneven distribution of weight. The shape was almost right. You could see where the cloven hoof had pressed into the soft ground, but the angles were wrong. The tracks seemed to turn too sharply, to change direction without the natural sweep that animals make. And they came from the forest, walked in a straight line across the meadow, then returned to the forest on a slightly different vector. No grazing behavior, no investigation of the vegetation. Just a direct path, like something mapping a route. I hiked the tree line, looking for more prints. I found scat that might have been deer, might have been something else. The consistency was off, too fibrous. I photographed everything with the digital camera I kept for official documentation and tried to decide if this was worth reporting. By the time I radioed Marcus at the main station, 4 days had passed and I'd seen the animal 3 more times. It never came closer than 150 yards. It never tried to interact with the cabin. But it was establishing a pattern. Dawn and dusk, it would appear at the edge of the meadow. It would cross, moving that strange, stilted gait, and disappear into the trees on the far side. Sometimes it would stop in the center of the meadow and turn to face the cabin, and I could feel it watching, though at that distance there's no way to confirm eyes were on me. Unusual wildlife behavior, I reported to Marcus, keeping my description clinical. Possibly diseased mule deer, tracking movement patterns and documentation. Keep records, Marcus said, his voice crackling through the radio speaker. If it represents a threat to yourself or visitors, flag it for wildlife management. Otherwise, document and report quarterly. That night, I reinforced the door latch. Not because I believed the animal posed a physical threat, but because something in the way it moved was setting off the part of my brain that handles threat assessment, the part that doesn't always listen to reason. The hoof prints kept appearing. Different locations, different patterns, and other animals started showing up. By early November, the snow had accumulated enough to make the high country impassable for casual hikers, but the trails around Raven Lake remained relatively clear. That's when I started finding evidence that other things were moving through the territory. The elk came first. I found it a quarter-mile north of the cabin, dead for maybe 2 days. The carcass was already being worked by scavengers, ravens, possibly mountain lions, but enough remained that I could take inventory of the damage. The animal was male, probably 4 years old, with a full set of antlers. The kill wasn't predatory in any recognizable way. The animal's chest cavity was opened, but not by teeth or claws. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. The organs were partially removed. The legs had been broken, not in the compound fractures that come from a fall or predator strike, but snapped at the joints with surgical precision. I photographed it, documented the location, reported it to Marcus as a potential lion kill, knowing he'd recognize the inconsistencies. "How certain are you it's predation?" he asked over the radio. "Not very," I admitted. "The wounds don't match standard lion behavior, but I can't identify what would make them." There was silence on the other end. Then, check the shelter logs. Voss would have documented unusual mortality if he saw it. That night, I went through Voss's entries more carefully. Most were routine. Weather observations, visitor counts, equipment maintenance. But starting in mid-September, the month before I arrived, There were more sporadic notes. Sep 17, elk calf bones near North Pass. Picked clean. Scavenger activity normal. Sep 26, deer population seems reduced. Haven't recorded a sighting in 4 days. Oct 2, something large moved through the North Trail. Heavy vegetation disturbance. No clear tracks. Oct 8, found second elk mortality. Similar to Sept incident. Internal damage. Will file formal report. The entries stopped there. Voss had transferred the following week. I recognized the pattern now. The disease or madness or whatever animated that first deer wasn't isolated. It was spreading. And more importantly, Voss had recognized the pattern before he left. The visits from the deer intensified. Now I was seeing it twice a day, sometimes 3 times. And it was bringing others. The first time I saw the group, it was dusk, that blue hour between light and dark when depth perception fails and shadows become 3-dimensional. 5 animals emerged from the eastern forest into the meadow, 4 that moved like the original deer, that stilted, wrong-jointed movement, and 1 that was almost right, still recognizably a mule deer. But something was off in its proportion and the way it held its head. They gathered in the center of the meadow, and they didn't move for 20 minutes. I watched from the cabin window, my hand on the rifle I'd removed from the security locker that afternoon. I'd never fired a gun at anything living, and I hoped it would stay that way, but something had shifted in my assessment of threat. These weren't sick animals in the way disease normally manifests. These were animals with their mechanics wrong, their software rewritten. They left together, moving back into the forest in a formation that suggested communication, organization, purpose. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found the marks on the cabin's frame. They were on the north side where a window opened to the valley, long, parallel grooves in the wood, about 6 inches apart. They looked like claw marks, but too deliberate, too measured. Something had run its claws down the wooden frame in a regular pattern, not in the frenzied gouging that would come from aggression, but almost like notation, like writing. I sanded them away, but every morning for a week, new marks appeared. Same location, same spacing, same terrifying intentionality. By mid-November, I had documented 17 distinct animal incidents. Elk with anatomically impossible injuries, deer with behavioral anomalies, mountain goats found in the valley far from their usual rocky habitat, moving in those coordinated groups. And always, the original deer was present, moving through the territory like it was shepherding something, or surveying something, or reporting back. I stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. The logbook entries became longer, more detailed, more desperate. Nov 10 observed 5 animals in meadow, 2 moved with bilateral leg issues. Formal gait suggests neurological damage, but animals appear otherwise healthy. No observed distress. Nov 14 found goat approximately 2,000 feet elevation drop from typical habitat. Dead, approx 48 hours. Injuries include open thoracic cavity, internal tissue removal, wildlife management request denied due to lack of clear threat. Nov 18 marks continue on cabin exterior, pattern consistent with previous observations, unable to identify maker, animal weight insufficient to crack wood, possibly intentional marking behavior. Nov 22, silence in forest exceeds previous observations. 0 bird activity in immediate area. Ambient noise suppression significant. Marcus's responses on the radio grew more concerned, but also more cautious. The Park Service doesn't like mysteries. Unexplained phenomena reflect poorly in quarterly reports. By late November, his official guidance was to document everything and maintain safety protocols. His unofficial guidance, conveyed in a brief moment when he thought his radio was off, was, if it comes down to it, report an animal incident and use the rifle. We'll back it. I understood what he was saying. I understood what he was afraid of. December came early that year. The snow started in the first week and didn't stop for 11 days. By the time it cleared, the high country was impassable, and the trails around the lake were buried under 3 feet of white. I was officially in winter isolation mode now. No resupply until February. No radio except in emergencies. Nothing between me and the mountains and whatever was moving through them. The animals had stopped appearing in the meadow. That should have been a relief. Instead, it was worse, because they were coming closer to the cabin. The marks on the wood became marks on my equipment. I found scratches on the exterior radio antenna, methodical grooves that suggested testing, examination. The winter storage locker showed signs of investigation. The latch hadn't been forced, but the area around it was marked with those same parallel gouges. Something was learning how to interact with my equipment, learning the structure of the cabin, learning me. And then, on December 9th, I saw the deer at the window. It was 3 a.m. I was awake because the wind had changed, was howling in a way that seemed to penetrate the cabin's insulation, setting the door frame to rattling. I'd gotten up to check the stove, to make sure the draft was open, and as I turned from the fireplace, I saw it. The deer was pressed against the window pane, its face just inches from the glass. In the firelight, I could see its eyes clearly. They were large, too large, with pupils that were too focused. There was intelligence there, not animal intelligence. That specific calculating quality that humans have. It was looking at me, studying me. I didn't move. I don't know how long we held each other's gaze. Seconds, minutes. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the deer simply stood there watching. Then it was gone. It left hoof prints in the snow, but the pattern was different this time. The animal had backed away slowly, without panic or urgency. The marks showed even pressure on each foot, a measured retreat, the behavior of something making a conscious choice. I kept the rifle loaded after that. The encounters became more frequent. I'd find it at different windows, the south side, the west side, always just watching, always leaving those marks behind. And I started to understand that this wasn't an attack, this was investigation. This was an animal that was developing an understanding of the cabin's architecture, an awareness of my routines, knowledge of my behaviors. It was learning how to think like me. That thought terrified me more than any conventional threat. Because predators are predictable. They follow evolutionary imperatives that make them rational. But an animal that was developing cognitive capacity, that was teaching itself to understand human concepts like shelter and tools and patterns, that was something else entirely. I started making a different kind of log. Not the official documentation, but notes on behavior patterns, on what the animal did in response to specific actions on my part. I opened the door at dawn. The deer appeared at the meadow's edge. I turned on the generator at 2 p.m. The deer came to the window within an hour. I moved equipment outside. The deer investigated it overnight. By December 18th, I was certain. The animal was developing a model of my behavior. It was learning to predict my actions, and it was teaching the others. The group visits resumed, but now they were different. The animals would appear in formation, would approach the cabin's perimeter in a coordinated pattern, and would focus their investigation on specific areas. It was like watching military operations. They had divided the cabin into sections and were systematically examining each one. The night of December 20th, they surrounded the cabin. I don't know how many there were, maybe 7, maybe more in the trees that I couldn't see. They emerged from the forest in the blue darkness just after sunset and took positions around the building. The lead animal, the original one I'd first seen weeks ago, positioned itself at the front window. 2 others moved to the side, testing the wood with their claws, marking it with those systematic grooves. One climbed onto the porch, something deer shouldn't be able to do, and tested the doorframe. I sat in the center of the cabin with the rifle across my lap and watched them investigate my refuge like it was a puzzle they were determined to solve. The rational part of my brain understood this wasn't an attack. The emotional part understood that an attack would almost be preferable. What was happening was something slower, more calculating. They were learning, they were adapting, they were determining how to enter. They left at midnight, moving back into the forest in the same organized fashion. But they left behind new marks, hundreds of them, covering the entire exterior of the cabin. In the morning, when I went out to document them, I realized they weren't random. They followed the structure. They marked the seams in the logs, the places where the building's integrity might be compromised. They mapped weaknesses. I radioed Marcus at dawn. "I need extraction," I said. "Not a request. Emergency protocol." The silence on the other end lasted 10 seconds. "Situation report," he finally said. I gave him everything. The full documentation, 8 weeks of observations, the progression of behavioral anomalies, the coordinated group activity, the systematic investigation of the cabin. Marcus paused. "That's not something we have a protocol for. Cavi, I need you to tell me the logical explanation." "There isn't one," I said. Another silence. "The airport at West Glacier is closed due to snow for the next week at minimum. The passes are impassable. If I send a ground team, I can get a truck to the trailhead in 2 days. 4-day hike in if they make good time. Can you hold for 6 days?" "I have enough supplies," I said. "The door locks. The rifle is loaded. I can hold." "Document everything," Marcus said. "If a team comes in and there are animals behaving abnormally, we need evidence. But Cavi, if they approach the cabin, if they pose an immediate threat, you do what you have to do." He was giving me permission to shoot them. Permission to do whatever was necessary. That night they came again. But this time they didn't just investigate. They tested the door. The animal on the porch placed its front hooves against the door frame and pushed, systematically. The door creaked but held. It pushed again, testing different points, different amounts of pressure. The animal at the window tested the latch mechanism, clicking its hooves against the metal. I stood inside with the rifle raised, sighting on the lead animal's head. My hands were steady. After 8 weeks of fear, I'd passed into a place beyond fear, a place of clear, cold purpose. The animal at the door seemed to understand it was being watched. It turned to look at me through the window, its strange forward-facing eyes meeting mine. Then deliberately it began to move. The movements were wrong. The legs bent at angles that shouldn't flex. The body contorted in ways that seemed to violate the basic architecture of cervid anatomy. It was like the animal was testing its own structural limitations, pushing its muscles and bones into configurations that nothing in nature should support. And then the leg cracked. I heard it. A wet, snapping sound that echoed across the silent meadow. The deer stumbled. For just a moment, the coordination broke. The movement became panicked, animal, real. Then it steadied itself. The broken leg held weight. The animal straightened, even with the limb at an unnatural angle, and looked directly at me again. There was no pain in that look, no distress, just continued, objective analysis. The other animals had gone still. They were watching the lead deer, watching it push its leg beyond normal capacity, watching it demonstrate that the constraints of biological reality didn't apply in the same way to them. I made a decision. I chambered around, aimed through the window, and fired. The lead deer dropped. No dramatic flourish, just a sudden absence of animation, the body collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. The shot had been clean, a round through the heart. I'd intended it as a mercy. The response was immediate. The other animals didn't flee. They converged on the dead deer, and what happened next is something I've tried for months to rationalize, to explain in ways that fit into reality as I understand it. They pulled the body apart, not with teeth, with those hooves, with claws that extended further than they should, with a coordination and purpose that suggested deliberate action. They dismembered the corpse systematically, calmly, like they were conducting an autopsy. The meat and organs they left where they fell. What they took were the bones. Specifically, they took the bones and carried them into the trees. All of this happened in under a minute. After they left, I went outside. I don't know why. Part of me needed to confirm it had been real. I walked to where the deer had fallen. The blood was real, the pieces were real, but the precision was wrong. The cuts were too clean, the separation too anatomically specific. A predator would have been more frenzied. This was surgical. I collected all evidence, photographed everything, and updated the logbook. Defensive action taken. Animal identified as threat. removed from area. What I didn't write was my actual conclusion. The deer wasn't dying, it was evolving, or being evolved. The others had extracted its skeleton like it was being studied, like they were learning something from the structure, the geometry, the engineering of how that body was supposed to work. And they were taking that knowledge back into the forest. Marcus's extraction team arrived 6 days later, on December 27th. 2 rangers, a wildlife biologist, and a veterinarian. They spent 4 hours combing the meadow and the surrounding forest. They found nothing. The hoof prints had been covered by snow and melting. The marks on the cabin could be attributed to bears or mountain lions, not satisfactorily but officially. The dead elk I'd documented was long since scavenged beyond clear identification. The missing goats and deer could be labeled as migration or normal predation. The veterinarian examined the cabin exterior and made a report about the marks. Bears, she concluded, maybe lions. Marcus looked at me for a long time during the hike out. He didn't ask many questions. I told him what could be officially reported. He told me during the final night of the hike when we were alone at a camp in the valley that Voss had quit suddenly, that he'd called Marcus during the winter of his second season and said he couldn't stay, couldn't explain why, but wouldn't return. "And you're sure?" Marcus asked. "About what?" I replied. "About whether what you documented was animals behaving abnormally or something else. Something that we don't have a framework to understand." I thought about how that first deer had looked at me, how it had analyzed the cabin, how it had seemed to be learning me, mapping me, understanding me. "I think," I said carefully, "that sometimes the wilderness contains things that are outside our ability to categorize. And sometimes the right response is to document that and move on." "Are you coming back next season?" Marcus asked. I told him no. I've had 6 months to process what happened at Raven Lake. I've written and rewritten this account. I've tried to make sense of the observations within conventional frameworks. Animals get sick, animals behave strangely sometimes. There are mysteries in nature that we don't understand. But here's what I know with certainty. Something was changing in that ecosystem. Something was moving through the animal population, altering it, shaping it toward a different kind of awareness. Whether it was a disease, a parasite, some environmental factor, or something with no name that science has a category for, I cannot say. The last entry in my Raven Lake log, dated December 27th, reads simply, "The forest is learning. I don't know what it's learning to be, but I know I don't want to be there when it finishes." I've applied for a position in Death Valley next season. Desert, open space, visibility for miles in all directions. I want to be somewhere I can see what's coming. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that meadow. I think about whether the marks have continued to appear on the cabin. I think about whether those animals ever mastered the door, whether they ever did figure out how to enter and investigate the spaces where humans keep themselves safe. Most of all, I wonder if Voss ever comes back, if Marcus ever went to check on the place, if the wilderness at Raven Lake is still there, patient and learning, waiting for the next person to come close enough to observe. The mountains don't ask questions, but they remember, and I suspect they're very, very good at learning. My name is Silas Crane, and I've been a ranger with the National Park Service for 13 years. That detail matters because nobody believes what happened at Gunsite Lake without understanding that I'm not the type to panic, not the type to see things that aren't there. I've pulled bodies out of glacial melt. I've tracked grizzlies through thick brush without a weapon. I've spent nights alone at fire lookouts in the high country when the wind came down hard enough to rattle the walls. Fear is something I've learned to compartmentalize, to file away in the back of my mind while my hands do the work that needs doing. I took the assignment at the remote cabin on Gunsite Lake in September because I needed distance, not from the park, but from the life I'd built outside of it. There was a marriage that had quietly dissolved into indifference, a house in Kalispell that felt more like a storage unit for my equipment than a home, and a growing sense that the civilized world had passed some threshold I could no longer tolerate. The cabin was supposed to be a reset, winter season at an unmaintained backcountry shelter, conducting wildlife surveys documenting the early hibernation patterns of the region's grizzly population, maintaining the trail systems that saw maybe 2 hikers a month once October arrived. The chief ranger said it would be quiet. He wasn't wrong, but quiet and isolated are different things, and I should have understood the distinction better before I packed my truck. The cabin sits 7 miles from the nearest maintained trailhead, accessible only by hiking or by the old ranger service road that becomes impassable once the snow starts. It's a sturdy structure built in the 1960s with a wood stove, a hand pump for well water, and enough propane for basic cooking. No electricity, no cell service, no radio except the hand crank emergency unit mounted on the back wall. Everything about it screamed solitude, and at the time solitude felt like salvation. I arrived on the 3rd of September, when the days still held heat but the nights were already developing an edge. The aspens hadn't started their color change yet, but you could see it coming in the way the light moved through the forest. I spent the first week settling in, checking the cabin's systems and beginning the trail surveys that would occupy my mornings. The lake itself was stunning, the kind of water that reflects the sky so perfectly you lose your sense of depth looking at it. Pine and larch surrounded it completely, with the peaks of the park rising brown and gray in the distance. Everything felt manageable then, meditative even. The first strange thing happened on my 9th day. I was working a section of trail about 2 miles from the cabin, clearing deadfall and flagging problem spots for the maintenance crews that would come through in spring. The day was overcast but mild, the kind of September afternoon where the temperature stays steady and the light has that diffused quality that makes distance hard to judge. I heard the first one around 2 in the afternoon. It was a sound like singing, or like something attempting to approximate singing. Not a human voice, but something working its way through the mechanics of human vocalization in a way that made my spine tighten. High and low notes in succession, almost like a test, like something was trying on different pitches to see which one felt right. It came from deeper in the forest, maybe 300 yards away, and it lasted maybe 8 seconds before stopping. I stood in the trail listening hard but heard only wind and the distant rush of water. My pulse was elevated, which I noted in the mechanical way you notice that your hands are cold. Logical explanations were easy enough. A porcupine can sound disturbing when it vocalized. Some birds, less common ones you might not recognize immediately, make sounds that human ears translate wrong. The park had recorded several species I still hadn't encountered up close. There was no reason to assume anything was wrong. I continued my work, but I was more aware of the forest after that. Aware of the boundary between the trails I'd cleared and the darker depth where the vegetation grew dense and the light never seemed to penetrate fully. I finished my section by 4 and headed back to the cabin, moving faster than my usual pace and telling myself it was because I wanted to document my progress while the light was good. That night, I made an entry in the logbook that I'd been asked to maintain. Daily weather observations, wildlife sightings, trail conditions. I noted the sound under a miscellaneous section, describing it as possible avian vocalization, source approximately 300 yards east of trail mile marker 4.7. Duration brief, no follow-up observed. Clinical, safe, the kind of entry that would be read by my supervisor and filed away without a second thought. But I also checked the emergency radio before I went to bed. It functioned normally, the hand crank mechanism producing a steady green light when I operated it. I tested the whistle mounted next to it, the one I'd never imagined needing. It worked too. Then I locked the cabin doors, which was something I hadn't done in my first week. The cabin didn't have locks, technically, but there was a heavy bolt on the inside of the main door, the kind of mechanism you'd use to keep animals out, or perhaps to keep something in. I'd never been sure which. The next morning, I found the first marking. It was on the trail, about a quarter mile from the cabin, right where the path climbed up from the lake level toward higher ground. Deep gouges in the bark of a larch tree, 4 parallel lines, as if something very large and very deliberate had scraped them downward. The marks started at about 9 feet up on the trunk and ran down to perhaps 6 feet. The exposed wood was still wet, still weeping resin. The damage had been done recently, within hours at most. I ran my hand along the marks without touching them directly, close enough to judge the depth. The claw marks, if that's what they were, had penetrated nearly through the bark in places, reaching into the softer wood beneath. The spacing between them was roughly 6 inches, which would suggest something with a hand or paw of significant size. A grizzly could make marks like that, though it was unusual for them to claw so high or so deliberately. This looked more like marking than feeding behavior, more like communication. I photographed everything, careful to include the trail and surrounding landmarks in the shots so the location would be clear. Then I continued on my survey route, moving with heightened attention to detail, noting every broken branch, every flattened area of vegetation where something large might have rested. I found 3 more marked trees over the course of the day, each one deliberately gouged, each one positioned as if to be seen. By the time I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I'd convinced myself that a bear had moved into the region, probably a younger male searching for territory. Territorial marking was normal enough even if the pattern seemed unusual. Bears can be deliberate. I'd seen them solve problems, watch humans, react to situations in ways that showed something more than simple animal processing. There was no reason to panic, but panic and caution are different things. That night, the sound came again, but closer, much closer. I was inside the cabin, having just finished cooking dinner, when I heard it. The same high-low vocalization, but this time originating from somewhere beyond the trees immediately behind the building. My stomach did something physical, a contraction that was part fear and part something else, something more primitive. I killed the propane lamp and moved to the window, keeping to the side so I wouldn't be silhouetted against any remaining light. The forest was dark, but not absolute darkness. My eyes adjusted quickly enough to see the shapes of trees, the slightly different texture of the underbrush. And then I saw movement, a shape passing through the space between 2 large pines, substantial enough to displace air, to cast a shadow that was distinctly wrong. It was large, much larger than a bear. And the way it moved was wrong, a kind of loping that seemed to involve limbs and configurations that shouldn't produce that kind of propulsion. My hand went to my belt where I kept a knife, muscle memory from my years responding to wildlife emergencies, and then I forced myself to breathe slowly. I could not shoot at shadows. I could not act on fear. The thing made the sound again, that testing vocalization, and I heard something else beneath it. Something that might have been recognition or hunger or frustration. The shape moved away from the cabin, back into the deeper forest, and I stood at the window for another hour, listening to the night, hearing nothing but wind and the normal sounds of the wild. In the log I wrote, nocturnal visitor, possibly large ungulate or bear, vocalization at approximately 2030 hours, source approximately 40 yards northwest of cabin. No direct observation, likely foraging behavior. This notation was a lie. I knew it was a lie while I was writing it. But I wasn't ready to acknowledge what I was actually dealing with, or even to formulate in words the growing sense that something was profoundly wrong in the forest around me. I locked the doors again. And this time, I did not sleep. By the 14th of September, I had stopped filing coherent log entries. The marks on the trees had multiplied, spreading in a pattern that suggested intention rather than natural marking behavior. There were now at least 15 of them, forming what I could only describe as a perimeter around the cabin area. The gouges were getting deeper, more aggressive. On one particularly disturbing specimen, I found dark material caked into the marks. I collected a sample, sealed it in a specimen bag I'd brought for wildlife surveys, and told myself I would have it analyzed once I returned to civilization. I never did. The sounds had become frequent. Multiple times a day, the high-low vocalization would cut through the forest, sometimes answered by a similar sound from a different direction, sometimes standing alone, always testing, always in some fundamental way that I couldn't justify with wildlife biology, probing. I began to understand that whatever was making those sounds was not simply communicating with others of its kind. It was communicating with me, testing my responses, exploring what I would do. On the 16th, I found the dead elk. It was perhaps 300 yards from the cabin, in a cleared area near the lake shore. The remains suggested it had died recently within a day or two, but it hadn't been killed in the normal way. The body was intact, no evidence of the typical bite pattern of a predator, no signs of the prolonged struggle that usually accompanies a kill. Instead, it looked as if the animal had been taken apart systematically, with parts arranged in a specific configuration around what remained of the central cavity. The ribs had been separated and splayed, not gnawed but deliberately positioned. The organs were gone entirely. The head, positioned at a particular angle, was missing the eyes. I did not take samples. I did not photograph it thoroughly. Instead, I marked the location on my mental map and returned to the cabin. The sense of intrusion that I'd been managing since the sounds began had escalated into something more concrete. Something was no longer content to mark trees. It was demonstrating its capabilities. That night, I wrote a message on the back of a Park Service form, sealed it in a waterproof bag, and buried it in a marked location about 2 miles from the cabin. In it, I documented everything, described the marks, the sounds, the dead elk. I included my coordinates and the date. It was a message in a bottle, essentially, something for whoever found my remains to understand what had happened. I thought about that message while I sat by the dying fire, listening to the sounds outside that never quite stopped now, that seemed to run in cycles of intensity and retreat. The cabin walls seemed to close in. The wood stove, which had been a source of comfort in my first week, became something else entirely. The crackling fire was loud, obscuring the sounds from outside, making me deaf to whatever was happening beyond the walls. But the silence that came when I let the fire die was worse. I found myself maintaining the fire at all hours, a kind of constant vigil that left me perpetually sleep-deprived and increasingly unreliable in my own assessment of what was happening. On the 18th, the vocalization changed. It became more complex, layered. I could hear multiple components to it now, as if something was attempting to reproduce human speech, but only in fragments, only in the pieces that didn't require a human mouth or human vocal cords to produce. Portions of sentences, phonemes rendered by whatever anatomy was creating this sound. Once I heard something that sounded like the word here, though that was probably my own mind imposing meaning on chaos. We do that, especially when we're afraid. We find patterns, we find intentionality. We construct narratives that make sense of the unbearable. I stopped checking the traps I'd set for small wildlife surveys. I stopped maintaining the detailed observations that had been my actual job. My entire focus narrowed to the cabin, to watching the perimeter, to listening and trying to interpret the intelligence behind the sounds, trying to understand what it wanted. The water in the well began to taste wrong around this time. Not actually wrong, not in any chemical sense, but it carried a flavor that made my mouth tighten. Mineral, but underneath that something else. I started rationing the water I'd brought in thermoses, using the well water only for washing. The bottled water ran out on the 20th. By then, I was no longer thinking clearly. I know that now, looking back, I was existing in a state of heightened awareness that was actually preventing rational thought. Every sound was analyzed, every shadow assessed for threat, every moment of quiet interpreted as the moment of attack. The mind is not built for this sustained level of vigilance. It begins to fail. It begins to make connections that aren't there, and to lose connections that are. The turning point came on the 22nd. I had been awake for approximately 40 hours. The sun was setting, and the light was doing that strange thing it does in September at altitude, creating multiple levels of shadow and illumination simultaneously. I was inside the cabin checking the propane again, though I knew it was fine, when I heard the sound change dramatically. Instead of the complex vocalization, it became something simpler, a voice. Not mine, but using something of my cadence, my speech patterns. It was calling my name. Silas. Silas. It was coming from multiple directions at once, or it was coming from one direction, and I was so disoriented that the echoes confused me about the source. Either way, I understood immediately that this was the moment of its reveal. The moment when it was done with whatever exploration or testing phase it had been in. I grabbed the emergency radio, cranked the handle with shaking hands, and attempted to broadcast a distress signal. Nothing, not even the normal static. The radio was dead, though I'd tested it only hours before. I'd been keeping it functional, checking it daily. But something had changed that, drained it or broken it or somehow prevented it from working. The voice continued calling from the forest, cycling through variations. Silas, come out. Silas, I'm here. Silas, we need help. Each iteration was closer to an actual human voice, as if it was learning, refining, testing different approaches, as if it was enjoying the process. I made a decision then, driven by something that wasn't logical but that seemed to be the only option available. I packed a bag with water, food, and the knife, and I left the cabin, not toward the voice, but toward the lake, toward the one direction I hadn't heard it coming from, hoping that once I was out in the open, I might have a better chance of assessing what I was dealing with and moving away from it. The moment I crossed the threshold, I understood the mistake. The night came down fast once I was away from the cabin's light. The moon was a crescent, offering barely enough illumination to see the ground immediately in front of me. I moved by feel and memory, orienting myself by the sound of the water and the general slope of the land. Behind me, the vocalization continued, but it had changed entirely. It was no longer attempting communication, it was hunting. The sound of movement through the forest intensified. Whatever was behind me was not bothering with stealth anymore. Branches cracked. Brush was forced aside, as if the thing was moving through the forest without regard for the damage it caused or the noise it made. This was a message. It was telling me it was not afraid. It was telling me that I could run, but it would catch me. It was telling me through pure physicality that it was in control. I reached the lake shore around what I estimated was midnight. The water was black, reflecting nothing. The mountains across the valley were barely visible, just a slightly different darkness against the sky. I was hyper-aware of my breathing, of the sound my feet made on the loose stone of the beach, of the absolute isolation of my position. There was nowhere to run that the forest wouldn't contain me in. There was nowhere to hide that something with predatory senses wouldn't find me. I made the decision to enter the water. It was cold enough to stun my breathing, cold enough that immersion was dangerous. But it was also the one environment where it might be temporarily disadvantaged. The sound behind me had stopped when I first waded in, which might have meant I'd made a miscalculation, or it might have meant the thing was actually considering this as an obstacle rather than an opportunity. I waded out to my waist, water soaking through my layers, the cold pressing against my chest with a sensation like hands gripping. I turned to face the shore, the knife held point out in front of me, which was laughable. A knife against something large enough to kill an elk systematically. A knife against something that had been testing my responses for nearly 2 weeks. The water behind me seemed to deepen the cold, as if the lake itself was turning hostile. I could no longer touch bottom, so I began to float, treading water, waiting. The thing came to the shore. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could see the shape of it, the displaced air as it moved, the suggestion of size and wrongness that made my depth perception fail. It seemed to be considering me, standing at the waterline, its head tilted. I remember the way the moonlight caught what might have been eyes, reflecting back at me with no warmth, no recognition. The eyes of something that wasn't considering me as a being but as a problem to solve. It made one of its sounds, the high-low vocalization, and something seemed to crack in my mind at that moment. Not break entirely, but fracture in a way that separated me from the moment itself. I was watching this from a distance, watching the floating man with the knife, watching the thing on the shore, watching the lake, watching the mountains. I was divided. The thing entered the water. It moved with a kind of writhing, as if its limbs weren't configured the way mine were, as if the simple act of swimming required a negotiation with its own anatomy that mine didn't. But it was fast. faster than I could move. I understood immediately that the lake had been a mistake. This wasn't a thing that was bound by the limitations of human biology. I began to swim toward the far shore, no longer thinking, only responding to the imperative to move away. The water slowed me more than it was slowing it. I could hear the sound of it behind me, the strange propulsion of whatever limbs it was using. My lungs burned. The cold had stolen most of the feeling from my extremities. I was tired in a way that made basic movement seem monumental. The shore came up suddenly, shallower than I expected, and I staggered out onto rock and gravel. I turned, expecting an attack, but the thing had stopped at the waterline. For a moment we faced each other, both of us breathing hard, both of us held by something beyond simple survival instinct. Then it moved along the shore, paralleling my position but not closing the distance. This was a moment of understanding for me. It wasn't trying to kill me, not yet. If it wanted me dead, it had had plenty of opportunities. What it was doing was something else. It was hunting not for the kill, but for the chase. It was extending the hunt, the way something intelligent might extend a pleasure, savoring the time before the ending. I ran up the slope, away from the lake, toward the deeper forest. Behind me, the hunt continued, the thing maintaining a distance that never quite closed, never quite opened. It was hurting me, I realized, directing me back toward the cabin, back toward the place where I'd started. The circle was completing itself. I reached the cabin as the false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. I could see the structure in the growing light, familiar and suddenly alien, like a place I'd known all my life that I was seeing for the first time with clear eyes. The thing that had been hunting me was still in the forest, waiting, watching. I knew this without seeing it. Our connection had become that intimate. I went inside and locked the door, though locks seemed absurd now. Symbolic gestures in the face of something that had demonstrated it could do whatever it wanted. I built the fire, more from the need to feel something than from any hope that fire would provide protection. The propane ran out as I was cooking, and I realized I hadn't actually eaten in days. The cabin was full of supplies, and I was starving, and this contradiction seemed profound until I understood that my body had been running on adrenaline for so long that hunger was a foreign concept. I sat by the fire and waited for the thing to show itself. It came to the window as the sun climbed higher, pressing itself against the glass in a way that suggested anatomy that shouldn't exist. The window cracked but didn't shatter. It withdrew, and I heard it moving around the cabin, testing the walls, probing for weaknesses in the structure. Once I saw its hand pressed against the window again, and I could count the fingers. There were too many of them, and they articulated in ways that shouldn't be possible. In the clearest part of my remaining consciousness, I realized what it wanted. Not just to hunt me, not just to extend the pleasure of the chase. It wanted me to understand something. It wanted me to comprehend that the world I thought I knew, the boundaries I thought were reliable, were actually permeable, that something could exist in the forest that violated every assumption I'd made about what was possible, that I was not the apex of intelligence in this place, that I was small. The thing called my name again, but this time it was different. It was calling with my mother's accent, with the precise intonation of her voice, reproducing memories of childhood in the shape of sound. It was calling with the voice of the woman I'd almost married, with the inflection that had made me feel like coming home. It was calling with versions of my own voice, echoing itself in my own patterns, creating a chorus of Silas Cranes that had never existed and couldn't exist, but that somehow were in the forest around the cabin. I put my hands over my ears, but sound travels through more than air. It travels through bone, it travels through water and wood and the fundamental structure of things. I could hear it in the wood of the walls, in the fire itself, in my own heartbeat. The thing had gotten inside my perimeter, not by breaking down a door or forcing an entry. It had gotten inside by making me understand that boundaries were not as fixed as I'd believed. Time became strange. I might have been in the cabin for hours or days. The light from the window cycled through various positions, and I couldn't track it with accuracy. I knew my bodily functions were continuing, but they felt disconnected from me. I moved because the thought occurred to move. I spoke because words seemed to be pressing out of me, needing to be expressed. I was not in control. I was witnessing myself, observing the man in the cabin with a degree of separation that would have been terrifying if I'd had enough coherence left to be terrified. On what I thought might be the sixth day, or perhaps the third, or perhaps no specific day at all, I made a decision. I wrote a message in my logbook, not a report, but something more honest. I described everything: the marks on the trees, the sounds, the dead elk, the thing in the water, the voices of people I'd known reproduced by something that had no right to know them. I wrote about the way it had hunted me, not to kill, but to teach me something about the nature of intelligence in the forest. I wrote about the realization that had come to me in the cabin, which was this: the wilderness doesn't care about our assumptions. It contains things we haven't cataloged. It contains things we don't have categories for. And those things sometimes can move as easily through our world as we move through water. I left the log open on the table. Then I gathered supplies and I left the cabin again, not running, not hiding, walking toward the forest with the calm acceptance of someone who has already made the only decision that matters. The thing was waiting where it had always been waiting. Patient in the way that something intelligent enough to extend a hunt would be patient. It watched me walk toward it. It didn't move. We stood perhaps 10 feet apart, and for the first time I saw it clearly. I saw the arrangement of its limbs, the way its body seemed to work against gravity and biology in equal measure. I saw the eyes that were intelligent and hungry and utterly indifferent to my existence as a separate being. "What are you?" I asked. It made its sound, not answering but acknowledging the question, understanding in its own way. "Why hunt me?" The question had no answer. Or perhaps the answer was that I was there, and it was there, and the hunt was what happened in the space where our existence overlapped. I walked past it, into the forest, deeper than I'd gone before, toward the parts of the wilderness that don't appear on any map. Behind me, I heard the thing begin to follow, and the hunt continued, extending itself into time I could no longer measure. I am writing this now, though I do not know when now is or how the words are leaving my mind and entering the world in a form you can read. I am no longer sure if I am in the cabin or in the forest or in some space between them. I am no longer sure if this is a message I'm writing or a memory I'm translating or a voice speaking itself through my hands. What I know is this: I came to the cabin in September seeking solitude, and I found instead something that cannot be easily categorized by the systems we use to understand the natural world. I found that the wilderness contains intelligence of a kind that doesn't respond to our attempts to understand or codify it. I found that some things hunt not for nutrition, but for the extension of a moment, the savoring of a chase, the privilege of extended contact with something other. To anyone who reads this log, I want you to understand that I am not insane. I was neither hallucinating nor experiencing psychological breakdown, though those possibilities might seem more comfortable than the alternative. What happened in the forest around Gunsite Lake was real in every way that matters. It left marks that would be visible if anyone looked. It left a structure of knowledge in my mind about the boundaries of the possible that cannot be unthought. If you come to check on me, if you find this cabin empty or find something that was once me reduced to component parts, understand that this is not a tragedy. It is not a loss that requires investigation or retribution. It is a teaching. The forest is not a place we can fully understand. It is not a resource that belongs to us in the way that bureaucracy claims it does. It is a place where other things think and hunt and exist by rules we haven't written. I do not recommend that anyone attempt to contact what I encountered. I do not recommend that anyone venture to Gunsite Lake expecting to find an explanation or a resolution. What exists there now is not looking for publicity or documentation. It hunts because that is what it does. It teaches because someone occasionally needs to learn. The man named Silas Crane came to Glacier National Park to find solitude. He found it, eventually, though not in a form he could have predicted or chosen. He found a silence deeper than any wilderness quiet. A kind of solitude that exists when you realize your existence is not the primary thing in the world around you. If you're reading this and you're wondering what happened to the ranger at Gunsite Lake, the answer is this: the forest kept him, and it's still hunting.